Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. Sometimes the people who change your life forever are the ones you were never supposed to meet. The late afternoon sun spilled across the elementary school parking lot in Cedar Grove, Ohio, painting long golden shadows across the blacktop as parents gathered for pickup. Inside room 12, colorful paper hearts, handmade cards, and crayon drawings covered every wall. Father's Day was only 3 days away, and Mrs. Reynolds smiled as her second-grade students carefully placed their finished projects into large manila envelopes. Around the room, excited voices floated through the air. Some children talked about backyard barbecues. Others giggled about surprise gifts hidden in closets. But at a small desk near the window, 7-year-old Sophie Whitmore sat quietly, pressing her pink marker against the corner of a drawing. Her blonde ponytail had started to slip loose during the day, and a tiny wrinkle appeared between her eyebrows as she concentrated. She wasn't drawing a superhero. She wasn't drawing a fishing trip. She wasn't drawing a father she remembered. She was drawing a father she had never known. The paper showed a white house with blue shutters. A giant oak tree stood beside it. Hanging from one sturdy branch was a wooden swing. Underneath the tree stood a little girl holding hands with a tall man whose face remained unfinished. Sophie stared at the blank face for several seconds before carefully drawing a smile. Then she wrote 3 words across the top in uneven letters. To Dad. Her teacher paused beside her desk. That's beautiful, Sophie. Sophie offered a small smile. Thank you. Will your mom help you mail it? Mrs. Reynolds asked gently. The little girl hesitated. Maybe. The teacher gave her shoulder a comforting squeeze before moving on to another student. Sophie lowered her eyes back to the picture. Most children in class knew exactly where their Father's Day cards were going. She didn't. Her father wasn't part of her life. He never had been. Every year, Elena Whitmore did her best to make Father's Day feel normal. But Sophie always noticed the empty space. Children notice everything, especially the things adults try hardest to hide. An hour later, Sophie climbed into her mother's aging silver Honda Civic. Elena greeted her with a tired smile. At 34, she worked long hours as a freelance illustrator and part-time bookstore clerk. Most days felt like a balancing act between deadlines, bills, and motherhood. Yet she always saved her brightest smile for Sophie. How was school, sweetheart? Sophie carefully slid the large envelope onto her lap. Good. Elena glanced over. What's that? A project. Can I see? Sophie quickly hugged the envelope tighter. Not yet. Elena laughed softly. Okay. Secret project. They drove home through quiet neighborhoods lined with maple trees and American flags fluttering in the warm June breeze. Later that evening, while Elena prepared grilled cheese sandwiches in their tiny kitchen, Sophie sat at the dining table staring at the envelope. The mailing instructions from school were printed neatly across the front. Parents were supposed to help address them. Sophie chewed her lip. Then she remembered something. Earlier that week, she had seen a television interview playing in the waiting room of her dentist's office. A reporter had spoken with a wealthy businessman. She couldn't remember much about him except his kind smile and the fact that he lived in New York. At the bottom of the screen, an address had briefly appeared. For reasons she couldn't explain, that memory suddenly returned. Children sometimes make decisions adults would never consider. Not because they understand the world less, because they believe in possibilities more. After dinner, while Elena answered emails from clients, Sophie quietly borrowed a pen. She copied the address from memory onto the envelope. It wasn't her father's address. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was simply an address. Then she carried the envelope outside to the blue mailbox at the corner of the street. The metal door creaked open. Sophie held the drawing against her chest for one final second. Dear Dad, wherever you are, she whispered. Then she slipped it inside. The envelope disappeared. The door closed. And with that simple mistake, 3 lives quietly began moving toward each other. Nearly 600 miles away, in a glass penthouse overlooking Manhattan, billionaire Graham Holloway stared out at the city skyline as darkness settled over New York. Father's Day was coming. As always, he planned to spend it alone. What he didn't know was that somewhere in the vast machinery of the postal system, a little girl's drawing was already traveling toward his mailbox. And by this time tomorrow it would land directly in his hands. The next morning arrived gray and quiet over Manhattan. Graham Holloway stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hand. 42 stories below, the city moved with its usual urgency. Taxis flowed through crowded streets. Delivery trucks stopped at loading docks. Thousands of people hurried toward places that mattered to them. Yet none of it held his attention. June always felt heavier than the rest of the year. Especially this week. Especially with Father's Day approaching. His assistant had already emailed a carefully arranged schedule designed to keep him occupied. Meetings. Investor calls. Charity events. Interviews. Graham canceled most of them without explanation. He did that every June. Few people questioned him anymore. Across 15 years of building Holloway Logistics into one of the largest transportation companies in America, he had earned the right to be mysterious. Still, even billionaires could not completely escape certain dates on a calendar. A soft chime echoed through the penthouse. Mail delivery had arrived. Graham barely noticed. Usually, he ignored physical mail altogether. Most correspondence was screened by assistants before ever reaching him. But this morning, something unusual happened. Downstairs, a sorting clerk noticed a brightly colored envelope mixed among legal documents and corporate reports. The handwriting was uneven, childlike. The envelope looked so out of place that it caught attention immediately. An hour later, it landed on Graham's desk. He glanced at it while reviewing shipping reports. For a moment, he considered setting it aside. Then his eyes stopped on the front. The address was correct. The recipient was not. Instead of Mr. Graham Holloway, it simply said, Dad. Graham stared. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Slowly, he set the report down and picked up the envelope. The paper was slightly wrinkled. The pink marker letters wandered unevenly across the front. Whoever wrote them had clearly been in second grade or third grade. A faint smile touched his face despite himself. Then he opened it. Inside was a folded drawing. The moment he unfolded the paper, something shifted in his expression. A white house, blue shutters, a giant oak tree, a wooden swing hanging from a branch, a little girl holding hands with a tall man. Above them, 3 simple words. To Dad. Graham lowered himself into his chair. His eyes moved across every crayon line, every carefully colored detail, every imperfect stroke. Then he noticed the letter attached to the back. Dear Dad, my teacher said we could send a Father's Day card. I do not know where you are. Mom says some people leave because life gets complicated. I do not really understand that. I just hope you are okay. If you ever see this picture, I think we would have fun on that swing. Love, Sophie. For several seconds, Graham simply sat there. Then several more. The city faded away. The reports faded away. Even the penthouse seemed to disappear. All he could see was a little girl's hope pressed onto a sheet of paper. Hope addressed to someone who might never read it. A slow breath escaped him. Years ago, he had imagined receiving a Father's Day card of his own. Years ago, life had looked different. He quickly pushed the thought away. Some memories remained too fragile to touch. Yet he could not stop looking at the drawing. Especially the swing. Especially the unfinished simplicity of it. It reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. At that exact moment in Cedar Grove, Sophie sat in class pretending to focus on math worksheets while secretly wondering whether her letter was already lost forever. Elena was shelving books at the bookstore, unaware that her daughter had mailed anything at all. Neither of them knew that hundreds of miles away, the wrong person had received the drawing, or that he had already made a decision. Graham reached for a blank sheet of stationery. For the first time in many years, he ignored every business email waiting for him. Instead, he picked up a pen and began writing. Dear Sophie, I think your letter found the wrong mailbox. But maybe it found the right person. 3 days later, a small white envelope appeared in the Whitmore family mailbox just after lunch. Sophie spotted it first while riding her bicycle in slow circles at the end of the driveway. The moment she noticed her name written across the front, she nearly dropped the bike. Her sneakers slapped against the pavement as she raced toward the mailbox. Mom, she shouted. Mom, somebody wrote back. Elena looked up from her laptop at the kitchen table, expecting a school notice or perhaps a birthday invitation. Instead, she found Sophie standing breathless in the doorway, clutching an envelope against her chest as though it contained treasure. "What do you mean somebody wrote back?" Elena asked. Sophie froze. Her eyes widened. In that instant, she realized she had never told her mother about mailing the drawing. Elena slowly closed her laptop. "Sophie." 5 minutes later, both of them sat at the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, illuminating the envelope between them. Sophie confessed everything. The school project, the drawing, the address she remembered from television, the secret trip to the mailbox. Elena listened in stunned silence. Part of her wanted to scold her daughter for mailing something to a stranger. Another part could not help feeling sorry for the little girl sitting across from her. By the time Sophie finished explaining, her eyes were fixed on the tabletop. "I just wanted somebody to read it," she whispered. Elena's heart tightened. For a moment neither spoke. Then Sophie carefully slid the envelope forward. "Can we open it?" Elena exhaled slowly. "Yes. Let us see what this mystery person had to say." Together they unfolded the letter. "Dear Sophie, I think your letter found the wrong mailbox. But maybe it found the right person. My name is Graham. I am not your father, but I wanted you to know that your drawing made me smile. The White House is beautiful. The oak tree looks strong. And that swing seems like the perfect place to spend a summer afternoon. You asked if your father was okay. I cannot answer that. But I can tell you something important. Sometimes people leave because life becomes complicated. That does not mean you are not worthy of being loved. In fact, the people who care about you most often stay much closer than you realize. Your mother sounds like one of those people." Sophie read the words twice. Then a third time. Elena quietly stared at the page. Whoever Graham was, he had chosen his words carefully. There was kindness in every sentence. No judgment. No false promises. Just warmth. Sophie smiled. "He likes the swing." Elena laughed softly. "Apparently he does." At the bottom of the letter was a handwritten question. "Did you name the little girl in the drawing?" Sophie immediately grabbed a pencil. "I need to answer him." "You certainly do not waste time," Elena said. "What should I tell him?" Sophie asked. Elena hesitated. She should probably end this correspondence. She should probably explain boundaries and strangers and common sense. Yet when she looked at the letter again, something stopped her. For the first time in years, she had seen her daughter's eyes light up when talking about Father's Day. "Tell him the truth," Elena finally said. Sophie grinned and began writing immediately. Across the country, Graham returned home that evening after a 12-hour day filled with meetings. Yet the first thing he did was check the mailroom downstairs. The second thing he did was carry Sophie's drawing back into his penthouse. He placed it on a side table near the window. The White House. The oak tree. The swing. Somehow the simple picture made the enormous apartment feel less empty. As city lights flickered across Manhattan, Graham found himself looking at the drawing again and again. For reasons he could not explain, he hoped another letter would arrive soon. Over the next several weeks, a new routine quietly formed between Ohio and New York. Every Thursday, Sophie checked the mailbox before she even took off her backpack. Every Friday, Graham found himself asking the mailroom attendant the same question before stepping into the elevator. Neither of them planned it. Simply happened. One letter became 2. 2 became 5. Then 10. Summer arrived in Cedar Grove with bright mornings and warm evenings. Sophie filled page after page with stories about her life. She wrote about losing a tooth during lunch. She wrote about a robin building a nest above their porch. She wrote about her favorite ice cream flavor and how she thought clouds looked like giant mashed potatoes. Graham answered every question she asked. He told her about traveling across the country for work. He described seeing cargo ships larger than football fields. He explained how trains carried products from one coast to another. Yet he carefully avoided discussing money, fame, or his company. To Sophie, he was simply Graham, the man who always wrote back. One afternoon, Sophie included a new drawing in her letter. The same White House stood beneath the oak tree, but this time she added flowers along the front walkway. A golden retriever sat near the porch steps. The swing still hung from the giant branch. On the back she wrote, "I think every good house needs a dog." Graham laughed when he read it. The sound surprised even him. Laughter had become rare inside the penthouse. For years, the apartment had felt more like a luxury hotel than a home. Beautiful. Impressive. Empty. Yet now colorful drawings occupied one corner of his living room. Sophie's first picture remained framed beside the window overlooking Manhattan. More drawings slowly joined it. The oak tree. The swing. The White House. Small pieces of a world built entirely from a child's imagination. Meanwhile, Elena watched the correspondence continue with growing uncertainty. At first, she had expected the letters to stop after a few exchanges. Instead, they deepened. Graham never crossed boundaries. He never asked inappropriate questions. He never made promises he could not keep. If anything, his letters revealed remarkable patience. One evening, after closing the bookstore, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table reading one of Graham's responses. Sophie had fallen asleep upstairs. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Her eyes stopped on a particular sentence. Sometimes people spend so much time chasing success that they forget success means very little if there is nobody waiting to share it with them. Elena read the line twice. Then a third time. It felt less like advice for a child and more like a confession from someone carrying loneliness he rarely discussed. For the first time, she wondered who Graham really was. Not his job. Not his address. Him. Across the country, Graham found himself wondering similar things. Sophie often mentioned her mother. "My mom worked late tonight. My mom fixed my bicycle. My mom helped me study spelling words. My mom makes the best pancakes in Ohio." The more he read, the more he admired a woman he had never met. He imagined Elena working long hours while still finding energy to make her daughter laugh. He pictured her reading bedtime stories and packing school lunches and solving problems nobody else ever saw. One Friday afternoon, a new letter arrived. Graham opened it expecting another drawing. Instead, a smaller sheet of paper slipped onto his desk. The handwriting was different. Adult. Careful. "Dear Graham, this is Elena. I wanted to thank you for being kind to my daughter. She looks forward to your letters more than you probably realize. Whatever your reasons were for answering that first envelope, thank you. You have brought unexpected joy into our home." Graham stared at the page for a long moment. Then a slow smile appeared. For the first time since this strange friendship began, the woman behind the letters had finally stepped into the conversation. And for reasons he could not quite explain, that single page felt every bit as important as the first drawing that had arrived weeks earlier. The exchange of letters changed subtly after Elena's note arrived. Sophie still filled pages with drawings and stories, but now another voice occasionally appeared between the colorful sketches and second-grade observations. Sometimes Elena added a short paragraph at the bottom. Sometimes Graham responded directly to her questions. What began as a child's accidental correspondence slowly evolved into something neither adult had expected. One September evening, Elena returned home carrying a stack of overdue bills and a canvas portfolio under her arm. The freelance illustration project she had spent 3 weeks completing had just been delayed. Payment would not arrive until next month. She dropped into a chair at the kitchen table and rubbed her temples. Across from her, Sophie was busy decorating an envelope with stickers. "Letter day?" Elena asked. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Graham says the leaves are starting to change colors in New York." Elena smiled. "They are changing here too." Sophie lowered her marker. "Mom." "Yes. Do you think Graham gets lonely?" The question caught Elena off guard. "Why would you ask that?" Sophie shrugged. "Sometimes his letters sound happy, but sometimes they sound like somebody sitting by themselves." Elena looked at the latest letter lying nearby. She had noticed the same thing. Graham never complained, never sought sympathy. Yet there were hints scattered between his words. References to empty evenings, quiet apartments, meals eaten alone after long workdays, success described without excitement, achievements mentioned without pride. The loneliness was never stated directly. It simply lingered beneath the surface. Later that night, after Sophie went upstairs, Elena reread one particular letter. Graham had written about a thunderstorm rolling across Manhattan. Most people watch the storm from restaurants or rooftops with friends. He had watched it alone from a penthouse window. The image stayed with her. Without overthinking it, Elena sat down and wrote back. She told him about Cedar Grove, about neighbors who still brought soup when someone got sick, about Friday football games and farmers markets and the old diner downtown where everyone knew everyone else's name. She described ordinary things, simple things, the kinds of details people only share when they want another person to feel included. 3 days later, Graham received the letter. He read it during a break, between meetings. Then he read it again during lunch, and once more that evening. For reasons he could not explain, Elena's descriptions of small-town life fascinated him. The town sounded imperfect, modest, real, the opposite of the world he inhabited every day. That night, instead of dictating responses through an assistant as he often did with correspondence, Graham sat down personally and wrote 4 pages. He told Elena about growing up in a middle-class neighborhood outside Pittsburgh. He described mowing lawns during summers, delivering newspapers before sunrise, building his first business from a spare bedroom apartment. He omitted the billion-dollar company, the magazine covers, the interviews. Those details felt strangely unimportant. For the first time in years he found himself writing not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Weeks passed. The letters continued. Sophie remained the center of the friendship, but a quiet connection had begun forming around her. One built from honesty rather than appearances. One October afternoon, Sophie bounded through the front door holding a flyer from school. "Mom!" she shouted. "The Fall Arts Festival picked my drawing." Elena looked up from the couch. "What drawing?" Sophie grinned. "The one with the oak tree and the swing." Elena laughed. Of course it was that drawing. The White House. The oak tree. The swing. The picture that started everything. Excited, Sophie immediately wrote to Graham about the festival. She included every detail. The display date. The location. The ribbon she hoped to win. 3 days later, Graham received the letter and stared at the invitation information longer than necessary. Then he looked across his office toward the frame drawing near the window. For the first time since this unexpected friendship began, a thought entered his mind that refused to leave. What if letters were no longer enough? The Fall Arts Festival arrived beneath a sky painted with bright October blue. Cedar Grove Elementary buzzed with excitement as families filled the hallways lined with student artwork. Paper leaves hung from bulletin boards. Folding tables displayed sculptures, paintings, and handmade crafts. Sophie could barely stand still. She wore her favorite yellow sweater and checked her drawing at least 6 times before the event officially began. The White House. The oak tree. The swing. It occupied a place of honor near the entrance after winning first place in her grade. Elena smiled every time she caught her daughter staring at it. "You know it is not going anywhere, right?" she teased. Sophie grinned. "I know. I just like looking at it." Across the country, a private jet touched down at a small regional airport less than 40 miles away. Graham Holloway stepped onto the tarmac carrying nothing more than an overnight bag and a folded invitation he had nearly convinced himself not to use. During the flight, he had questioned the decision at least 20 times. What was he doing? Flying halfway across the country to attend a school art show because of a child he knew only through letters. Yet every time he considered turning back, he remembered the drawings hanging in his penthouse. He remembered the letters waiting in his mailbox. And he remembered something else. For the first time in years, he had felt connected to people outside the walls of his carefully controlled world. By late afternoon, Graham parked outside Cedar Grove Elementary. He stood across the street for several moments, studying the building. Parents laughed together near the entrance. Children raced across the lawn. The scene felt strangely foreign and strangely familiar at the same time. Finally, he crossed the street. Inside the school gymnasium, Sophie was explaining the story behind her drawing to another student when a familiar voice interrupted from behind. "I think the dog was a very good addition." Sophie froze. Her eyes widened instantly. She knew that sentence. She had read it months ago in one of his letters. Slowly she turned around. A tall man stood a few feet away. Dark blazer. Kind eyes. Slightly nervous smile. For a second neither moved. Then Sophie's mouth fell open. "Graham," she whispered. Graham nodded. "Hello, Sophie." The little girl launched herself forward before anyone could say another word. Graham barely had time to react before she wrapped her arms around him. He laughed softly and hugged her back. Around them, conversations continued. Nobody paid much attention at first. Then recognition began spreading through the room. One parent whispered to another. A teacher looked twice. Someone quietly searched a name on a phone. Within minutes, surprised glances followed him across the gymnasium. Elena had been speaking with another parent near the refreshment table when she heard Sophie shout. She turned and saw her daughter standing beside a man she recognized instantly. Not from the letters. Not from personal experience. From magazines. News articles. Business interviews. Her breath caught. Graham Holloway. The Graham Holloway. Billionaire entrepreneur. One of the most recognizable business leaders in America. Elena stood frozen. Suddenly countless details made sense. The Manhattan address. The careful references to travel. The stories about large projects in distant cities. He had never lied. He had simply never told them everything. Across the room, Graham's eyes met hers for the first time. The noise of the gymnasium seemed to fade. For months they had shared thoughts, stories, and pieces of their lives through handwritten pages. Yet this was the first moment they truly saw each other. Elena walked slowly toward them. Sophie beamed from ear to ear. "Mom," she said excitedly. "Graham came." Elena stopped a few feet away. Graham offered a gentle smile. "Hello, Elena." She stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You never mentioned you were Graham Holloway." Graham's smile faded slightly. "No," he admitted quietly. "I did not." The excitement of the festival faded into an uneasy silence as evening settled over Cedar Grove. After the event ended, Graham remained in town instead of returning immediately to New York. Sophie could not stop talking about the surprise visit. She replayed every moment during dinner, every smile, every conversation, every detail she could remember. Yet Elena barely touched her food. Her thoughts kept returning to the same realization. For months, she had shared pieces of her life with a man she believed was simply a kind stranger. Now she knew he was one of the wealthiest and most influential people in the country. The difference should not have mattered. Somehow it did. Later that night, after Sophie had gone upstairs, Elena sat alone on the back porch. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves. A porch light glowed softly above her. She heard footsteps approaching before she saw him. Graham stopped a respectful distance away. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt heavier than any conversation they had shared through letters. Finally, Graham broke it. "I should have told you." Elena stared out at the dark yard. "Why did you not?" Graham considered the question carefully. "Because the moment people learn who I am, everything changes." "And you thought that should have been your decision?" He lowered his eyes. "No." Elena folded her arms. "Do you have any idea what this looks like from my side?" Graham remained quiet. "For months Sophie trusted you. I trusted you. Then I discover you have been hiding something enormous." "I never lied." "You left out the biggest part of your life." The words landed harder than either expected. Graham looked away toward the distant streetlights. "Maybe I did." Elena studied him. For the first time he seemed less like a billionaire and more like a man who genuinely regretted something. Yet that only made the situation more confusing. "Why answer the letter in the first place?" she asked softly. Graham exhaled. The question lingered between them. Then after a long pause he finally answered. "Because of Father's Day." Elena frowned slightly. Graham looked toward the stars above the neighborhood. "Years ago I was engaged." His voice remained calm, but something fragile hid beneath it. "We were planning a future. A family. We spent weekends looking at houses. She wanted a large oak tree in the yard." Elena felt her chest tighten. "What happened?" Graham smiled sadly. "Life happened." He paused. "The future we imagined never arrived." For several seconds neither spoke. Graham continued quietly. "Every Father's Day reminds me of the family I thought I would have. That is why I usually disappear that week." Then Sophie's letter arrived. He laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. A little girl addressed a drawing to a father she had never met. Somehow, it landed on the desk of a man who never became one. Elena looked down. Suddenly the framed drawing in his penthouse made more sense. The letters made more sense. The loneliness Sophie had noticed made more sense. You answered because you understood. Graham nodded once. More than I wanted to. The porch fell silent again. Yet despite the honesty, uncertainty remained. Elena realized something that unsettled her. She had started caring about the man behind the letters long before learning his name. Now that she knew who he was, she no longer knew where she stood. Was this friendship real? Was she simply part of a chapter in his healing process? A reminder of what he had lost? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. The next morning, Graham left Cedar Grove. Sophie cried when she hugged him goodbye. Elena remained polite but distant. By the time his car disappeared down the road, a quiet ache had settled over all three of them. Back in New York, Graham returned to his penthouse and found the drawings waiting near the window. The White House, the oak tree, the swing. For the first time since receiving the very first letter, he wondered whether he had already lost the people who had brought life back into his world. The weeks after Graham's visit felt longer than they should have. Winter slowly approached Cedar Grove. Leaves disappeared from the oak trees. Cold winds swept through quiet streets. The letters became less frequent, not because anyone wanted them to, but because uncertainty had settled where comfort once existed. Sophie still wrote faithfully every week. Graham still answered every letter she sent. Yet something had changed between the adults. Elena remained polite, careful, guarded. She convinced herself it was for the best. People like Graham Holloway belonged to a different world. A world of boardrooms, private jets, and headlines. She and Sophie belonged to a town where everyone waved at each other from pickup trucks and grocery store aisles. The distance between those worlds felt impossible to cross. One snowy evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table working on another drawing. Elena glanced over her shoulder. The familiar White House stood beneath the familiar oak tree. The swing still hung from its branch. "You really love that house," Elena said. Sophie smiled. "It feels happy." Elena kissed the top of her daughter's head and returned to washing dishes. She did not notice Sophie quietly adding something new to the picture. A man stood near the porch. A woman stood beside him. A little girl sat on the swing. Hundreds of miles away, Graham stared at the newest drawing from the same spot near his penthouse window. The image held his attention for a long time. Then he noticed the three figures. His chest tightened. For months he had accepted the letters as a gift he never expected. Yet now the thought of losing that connection felt unbearable. He looked around the enormous apartment. Marble floors. Designer furniture. Floor-to-ceiling glass. Everything money could buy. None of it mattered. None of it ever had. His eyes returned to the drawing. The White House. The oak tree. The swing. An idea began forming. By the following week, Graham was standing on a piece of land he owned outside Cedar Grove. Years earlier, he had quietly purchased several acres as part of a logistics expansion project that never happened. The property remained untouched. Snow covered the open field. Bare trees lined the edges. Most people would have seen empty land. Graham saw something else. He saw a drawing. Over the next 2 months, architects, builders, and landscape designers received instructions unlike any they had ever heard from him. The property already had permits and basic site preparation completed years earlier when Graham had considered a business expansion project that was never built. Construction crews worked around the clock through winter, allowing progress that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. No glass mansion. No luxury estate. No modern showcase. Instead, Graham handed them copies of Sophie's drawings. Every detail mattered. The white exterior. The blue shutters. The front porch. The oak tree. The wooden swing. As winter gave way to early spring, the impossible slowly became real. Meanwhile, Elena knew nothing about the project. Life continued as usual. Work. School. Bills. Small victories. Small worries. Then one Friday afternoon, an envelope arrived unlike any other. Inside was a handwritten note from Graham. "Dear Elena and Sophie, there is something I would like to show you." If you are willing, please meet me next Saturday at noon. The address is enclosed. Sophie nearly bounced off her chair with excitement.
Elena hesitated.
Yet curiosity eventually won. The following Saturday, they followed a winding country road several miles outside town. When the GPS announced they had arrived, Elena slowed the car and stared ahead in disbelief. Sophie's mouth fell open. Standing beyond a white wooden fence was a house. White walls, blue shutters, a broad front porch. Beside it stood a giant oak tree. Hanging from one branch was a wooden swing moving gently in the spring breeze. It was the drawing. Not similar to it. Not inspired by it. It was the drawing brought to life. Graham stood waiting beneath the tree. For a moment nobody moved. Then Sophie whispered the only words she could manage. "You built my picture." For several seconds nobody spoke. The spring breeze moved gently through the branches of the oak tree as Sophie ran forward across the grass. Her laughter filled the air as she reached the swing and touched the wooden seat as though she needed proof it was real. Elena remained frozen beside the car. She looked from the house to the tree and then to Graham. Every detail from Sophie's drawing stood before her. The blue shutters, the front porch, the flower beds, even the small stone pathway leading to the front door. Graham walked toward her slowly. "I know it does not change everything," he said quietly, "but I wanted you to understand something." Elena looked at him. "What?" Graham glanced toward Sophie, who was already swinging beneath the tree with pure joy written across her face. "The letters changed my life." Elena felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. For months she had tried convincing herself that the connection between them belonged only to Sophie. Yet standing there she knew that was not true. Somewhere between. The first envelope in this moment, all three of them had become part of the same story. Graham looked toward the house. "I spent years building companies, buildings, projects, things people could measure." He smiled softly. "Then a 7-year-old mailed a drawing to the wrong address and reminded me what I was actually missing." Elena laughed through tears she had not realized were forming. "You built an entire house because of a drawing."
"No," Graham replied gently.
"I built it because of the people who drew it." They walked together toward the porch. Inside, the house felt warm rather than grand. Comfortable rather than impressive. Family photographs did not fill the walls yet, but somehow it already felt like a home waiting for memories. Sophie explored every room with endless excitement. She discovered a reading nook beneath a window. A bedroom painted exactly the shade of blue she loved. A shelf displaying copies of every drawing she had ever mailed. When she found the framed original Father's Day picture hanging in the hallway, she stopped completely. For a long moment she simply stared. Then she turned toward Graham. "You kept it." Graham nodded. "It was the most important letter I ever received." 1 year later, the oak tree had grown greener than ever. The swing moved gently beneath its branches on a warm June afternoon. Friends from Cedar Grove gathered in the backyard. Laughter drifted across the lawn. The White House no longer looked new. It looked lived in. Loved. Home. Sophie stood near the tree holding a large envelope. Her smile was impossible to contain. "I made something," she announced. Graham knelt beside her. "Another drawing?" "The most important one." She handed him the envelope. Carefully he opened it. Inside was a picture almost identical to the first drawing she had mailed long ago. The same White House. The same oak tree. The same swing. But this time the figures were different. A woman stood beside a man. A little girl sat happily between them. Above the picture, written in much neater handwriting than before, were 2 simple words. "Dear Dad." Graham's vision blurred instantly. For a moment he could not speak. Sophie wrapped her arms around him. "This one is not going to the wrong address," she whispered. Nearby, Elena pressed a hand against her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Graham held the drawing carefully, as though it were priceless. In truth it was. He stood and walked toward Elena. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the oak leaves overhead. The same tree that had existed first as crayons on paper. The same tree that had somehow brought 3 lives together. Graham reached into his pocket and removed a small ring box. Elena's eyes widened. Sophie gasped dramatically. Laughter rippled through the guests. Graham smiled and took Elena's hands in his. The best things in my life arrived when I was not looking for them, he said. A letter. A friendship. A family. I do not want to spend another day without any of them. Elena Whitmore, will you marry me? Tears slipped down her cheeks as she laughed and nodded at the same time. Yes. Applause erupted around them. Sophie cheered the loudest of all. As Graham slipped the ring onto Elena's finger, the swing moved gently beneath the oak tree. The White House stood proudly behind them. And somewhere beyond the laughter, beyond the sunlight, beyond every coincidence that had brought them there, one simple truth remained. Sometimes the wrong address leads exactly where the heart was meant to go. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Chosen by Love. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories of hope, second chances, family, and true love to life. Let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you received Sophie's letter? Thank you for being part of our Chosen by Love family, and we will see you in the next unforgettable story.